Microbeads have gone from obscurity to a topic of legislation in several states, including Indiana. The tiny plastic beads used in several products have proven they can stick around in the environment for a very long time, including in Lake Michigan. To talk about it, we have Jennifer Caddick, who is the engagement director for the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Jennifer, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
All right, so what are microbeads and why are they not good?
Sure. Microbeads are tiny little sort of round plastic particles that are included in personal care products. So things like facial scrubs, body washes, even some toothpastes. And they're supposed to help you, cleanse your skin or your teeth or whatever. But the problem is once you use that product and wash it off, it goes down the drain, and ultimately those little tiny plastic pieces end up in our waterways.
And they're tiny. They're like the size of salt, little salt beads.
Exactly. They're little tiny pieces. Some of them you can't even really see. You would need a microscope. So they're, really difficult to treat before they end up in our waterways.
All right. So, how long have these things been around? Is this something that we're just realizing now is a problem in the environment?
These products have been around for a while, but frankly, it's just been the past couple of years that we've realized that they're a problem for our waters. So a researcher, Dr. Sherry Mason, who is with the State University of New York's Fredonia campus, so near Lake Erie, started an expedition 2 or 3 years ago looking at the issue of plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. And as they were going around the lakes and sampling, they discovered, millions and millions of these tiny little plastic pieces. And then they started asking the question of, well, where are they coming from, and ultimately traced it back to those personal care products we're using.
And we actually had her on a while ago, before all this really started to kick up. And there's a lot of talk about plastic in the oceans and how big of a problem that is. And she said you're actually finding more plastic in Lake Michigan than you were finding in the ocean at this point because of these microbeads.
Yeah. It's a huge problem for the Great Lakes, especially when you think about the fact that this is the world's largest freshwater resource. It's our drinking water. It's a recreation resource for millions of Americans and Canadians. So it's certainly an issue of concern, and I think that's why so many folks have raised concerns about this.
But in a way, you mentioned they're like in things like toothpaste. So are we sure that there's any real problem? They've been going into us for a while now.
Mostly they typically aren't ingested. Your toothpaste, you swish it around and send it down the drain.
Right.
The question has been what happens once it's out in the ecosystem. And like I said, it's our world's largest freshwater resource. We just don't want to be having plastic out there, especially when there are so many readily available natural alternatives that won't cause the problems that the plastic pollution will.
And what is this? Do we know what it's doing out there in the environment? It's accumulating in the fish, right?
Well, we know that fish and wildlife, especially waterfowl, birds that spend time around the water, are consuming plastic. So researchers have looked at, the contents of fish guts and said, oh, there's plastic in there. Fish confuse these teeny little pieces for, algae or other food items that they might eat. We don't quite know what the cumulative effects are, beyond the fish, if it's going and causing further problems up the food chain yet. I know that researchers are looking at that, but it's just not okay that fish are consuming plastic instead of the natural things they should be consuming so that they can grow and thrive.
And often with science, it takes a very long time for people to react to those kind of findings. But actually, lawmakers are reacting pretty quickly to this. Illinois banned these microbeads, last year?
Yeah, so last year, the state of Illinois was the first state in the U.S. to pass legislation to phase out the manufacture and sale of personal care products with microbeads in them. And of course, as we know, the Indiana General Assembly just passed legislation and sent it on to Governor Pence here. So states are stepping up pretty quickly on this issue, which is great to see.
And there's also, I believe, Michigan is also looking at a similar bill. So
bills are popping up all over. Almost every Great Lakes state right now is considering legislation, from New York to Wisconsin and Minnesota, Michigan, as you mentioned, in between. And I also should note that most of the major personal care product manufacturers, so Johnson & Johnson, L'Oreal, Procter & Gamble, once this issue was brought to their attention, said, we're going to voluntarily phase these out. So we have sort of a two-part approach. The companies are saying we're going to phase it out, but the legislation is just making sure the issue is settled.
All right. So now that lawmakers are taking heed of this issue, you're seeing the companies react. So we probably won't see a lot of microbeads, no pun intended, over the next couple of years, no matter really what happens.
Yeah, most of the companies are planning to phase them out by 2016 to 2017. The legislation is a little bit further out, 2018, 2019, but within the next couple of years, we'll see those plastic products in your personal care products replaced with natural things like sand or other things.
You know, when I had somebody from the Alliance for the Great Lakes here, I wanted to ask, and you mentioned all these states around the Great Lakes starting to work together. One of the ways they work together is with the Great Lake Restoration Initiative. There's now there's a bill before Congress. The president's budget actually cuts funding to the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative by some $50 million. This is one of, I think, his signature programs here, but it looks like states are fighting him on this. Describe what's going on.
Absolutely. Yeah. So as you know, the president, when he announced his budget earlier this winter, included a cut, unfortunately, for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which has funded real hands-on, on-the-ground restoration projects around the Great Lakes that we are seeing are making an actual difference for the health of the lakes. We know that the president's budget is just step number one in the entire federal budget process, so it's a kind of a start of the conversation. But we've seen legislators in a bipartisan fashion around the Great Lakes region step up and say, this is not okay. We need to fund this program at the full $300 million. And in fact, just this week, I believe, over 50 legislators from both parties, from a range of Great Lakes states, sent a letter to the key appropriations committees saying, we need to support this program.
There seems to be far more bipartisan consensus on this than just about anything else. We know why that is?
You know, it's because the Great Lakes define our region. You know, we love the Great Lakes no matter what party we're from, what community we're from, in all 8 Great Lakes states and the 2 Canadian provinces. So I think folks really recognize how important the Great Lakes are, of course, to our economy, but just to our day-to-day lives. We drink the Great Lakes, and it's a place where we go with our family and friends to relax and refresh.
So describe some of the projects that have happened since 2010, since this whole effort started.
Sure. There's actually a really great website put together by the Joyce Foundation, which is a large foundation that has supported Great Lakes restoration over the years, called Great Lakes Great Impact. And it profiles a whole series of projects. So it has cleaned up, for instance, in White Lake, Michigan, there was a huge toxic contamination area called an area of concern. So Great Lakes restoration funding has come in and helped those communities get those toxins out of their lake, and now it's a restored ecosystem and taken that off the list of toxic hotspots. It funds things like invasive species removal, plants that are invasive, removing them from marshes so we can get them back to natural states. A whole range of on-the-ground practical projects are being funded by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative.
And several Superfund sites that have been around for a generation, those are being cleaned up now under this.
Absolutely. Yeah, the nomenclature in the Great Lakes is an area of concern, which basically means a big toxic hotspot. But that's one of the key areas that the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has focused funding on, to make sure that we can get those toxins out of the ecosystem and restore those areas so that everybody is available to use them.
Is there concern, though, the president is coming through his last 2 years of his time in office, that this may go away with the Obama administration?
There's another piece of legislation called the Great Lakes Ecosystem Protection Act, or GLEPA is the acronym. And what that legislation would do is it would set a 5-year authorization for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. So it would have a little bit of permanency for the program, so we wouldn't have to go completely back to the starting block every single year and have the same kind of battle. So that's another piece of legislation that we've seen strong bipartisan support, because I think everyone realizes just how important restoring the Great Lakes is, and making sure that we can plan for the future with those funds.
So they're trying to really basically enshrine this in law, so it becomes rather permanent.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that we've made big progress on Great Lakes restoration, but there's still so much more to be done. And so making sure that government agencies, businesses, nonprofits, those working to restore the Great Lakes can plan for the future and know that we will be able to commit to those long-term plans that are needed to restore the lakes.
Jennifer Caddick, she's the engagement director for the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Thank you so much for being on.
Thanks so much, Steve.